Hello, everybody. So glad to be with you all. I'm sorry that I was unable to actually attend and be there live. I would have really loved to have done that, but I did have an opportunity come up that I just couldn't say no to. So I still wanted to fulfill the duties that I have to provide you with hopefully some valuable take-home information regarding stress resiliency and how to utilize biometrics or information that we can gather from the body to help guide your decision making for recovery and for mental and emotional well-being, because it's something that is very pertinent to everybody, every human. It's always good to be able to speak to a local company. I don't get to do that very often anymore, just given the nature of what I do, but I'm really glad to speak to those who are here in Greenville, as I am a native of Greenville. Well, I wanted to show you my face before we jumped in. Obviously, you'll hear my voice the entire time, but I just wanted to give you all a greeting and say hello before we jumped into talking about HRV, or heart rate variability. So again, I hope that you enjoy this and take something practical from it. So today's talk is going to be about HRV, or heart rate variability. If you've never heard of heart rate variability before, you will learn about it today. It is a very confusing yet ubiquitous measurement, and it is a key metric, in my opinion, and I know I'm a little bit biased here, to effectively monitoring changes in your stress response. Didn't introduce myself formally, but I am Dr. Jay Wiles. I am a clinical health and performance psychologist and the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Hanu Health. We're a digital mental health company that uses biometric information or data from the body as a mechanism to better create a roadmap for managing emotional health and well-being, as well as recovery. Really glad to be with you all today. Here I am. You've already seen me. This was going to be a bit, was never going to be a shocker whether I was in person or here. I do want to mention a few disclaimers or conflicts of interest. I am the co-founder and chief scientific officer of Hanu Health. So we are a digital mental health company. As I mentioned before, obviously I have vested interests, so I wanted to mention that before we go. And then also I work as a research consultant and advisor for a few companies, one notably being Solace Life Sciences. Today, we're not going to spend a ton of time because we can get really into the weeds with this stuff. Actually, we can create a whole PhD in this material. And I think for the sake of today, I want to just hit the highlights. And for me, it's all about taking something practical. I don't want to provide too much 30,000 foot stuff that's not usable or practical or gets too into the weeds. I want this to be something that we can take a few bullet points, key takeaways for helping you to better manage stress through understanding your body and how it manifests in your body. So I'll provide an intro and a basic primer on the human stress response, on HRV, and then we'll talk about practical applications. So why is this important? Well, HRV is everywhere. If you own an Apple Watch or a Whoop band or Fitbit or an Oura Ring or my company, Hanu Health, we know that in most major consumer wearables, and I would say all at this point, is tracking this thing called HRV, or heart rate variability. So it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But the problem is that it causes a lot of confusion. People say heart rate variability and they immediately think, is that heart rate? And the answer is kind of, but it actually tells us a lot more than what heart rate would. If we think about these two terms, heart rate is more of like the panned out view, where heart rate variability is more of like the microscopic high fidelity view. And I'll explain that more in its detail here in just a second. But it's really important to understand HRV. There's a reason why Apple Watch and Whoop and Fitbit and Oura and my company Hanu, there's a reason why we include heart rate variability as a metric. It's because it tells us a lot, and it can give us really great insight and direction if we know how to use it. But the first thing is to fully understand what it's telling us, and then we can use it as a guide or roadmap. To understand HRV, or heart rate variability, and I'll just talk about things in terms of HRV so that I don't have to say heart rate variability 1,000 times, we have to understand stress. My guess is that you've heard of this word stress before. You might be experiencing a little bit right now as we kind of talk about words that you may have never heard before, Or hopefully, especially if you're watching this on a Friday, maybe there's a lift of stress because we know we're going into the weekend and Memorial Day is coming up. So we'll all have a day off and can go to the beach or the lake or wherever it may be. But we need to understand stress because I think sometimes stress gets a little bit confusing. A lot of people hear stress and they immediately think something bad or negative. I'm going to convince you today that that is not the case and that stress is actually inherently good. So how do we define stress? Stress is a physiological or psychological response that occurs when an individual perceives a demand or threat that exceeds their ability to cope with it. It is a natural reaction, hence and key, natural reaction that evolved as a survival mechanism, preparing the body for action in the face of challenges or dangers. When we think of stress, a lot of times we think bad. We hear on news reports that people are experiencing heightened stress, and that's causing physiological or bodily damage, psychological damage. All of that is true. But at its core, what is stress? Well, stress is a warning sign. Anxiety is a warning sign. It is not something inherently at its core bad. It's actually good. Without stress, we would be in a lot of danger. The reason being is because stress informs us of perceived danger. When our perception that we do not have the ability to cope is exceeding, then that is what then turns into stress or anxiety. There are two types of stress that we talk about, and most people are familiar with the concept of distress, but we also want to talk about the concept of eustress, which is stress that works for us rather than against us. So when we talk about distress is more of the negative or harmful stress, especially as it compounds over time. And that's going to be key here. The one thing to remember is that acute or really short-term experience of stress, it's not bad. It's really good for us, actually. However, longer term, or what we call chronic stress, that's the killer. That's the one that we really want to be careful for. So it's the type of stress, and this is what distress is, it's the type of stress that exceeds an individual's ability to cope and can have adverse effects on physical and mental well-being. So an example would be things like feeling overwhelmed, feeling anxiety, feeling like you don't, or you are not measuring up, or that the mountain is too big for you to climb. That's distress. On the other side of things, something called eustress. Now, eustress is a positive or beneficial form of stress. It's the type of stress that will motivate us, it will energize us, and it leads to positive outcomes and personal growth. Well, what's an example of eustress or a way that stress can work for us? Exercise. Sometimes we refer to this as hormesis or hormetic stress, but it's a stress that builds us back bigger, faster, stronger. It's a positive or beneficial form of stress. Sometimes when we are encountering challenging tasks, these can be forms of eustress. It's the motivation and the energy we need. It can pump us up to get things done. For athletes, it's like excitement before a performance or before they take the field or the court or get on the golf course. So there are two main forms of stress. We have to understand, how is stress working for us and how is it working against us? This slide is intended for me to demonstrate that stress is not inherently bad. There actually can be really good forms of stress, and I would say that it's inherently good. What we do not want is compounding stress or compounding distress. And we can use markers from our biology to better understand the effects of stress on our body, the effects of distress on our body. And that's HRV, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. Don't let these words scare you. Autonomic nervous system. I wanted to put this slide in here because I think sometimes if we do not provide justice to the science, then it deters us away from understanding the full nature of how stress affects us on a physiological level. What we know about the autonomic nervous system is that there are two distinct branches. Autonomic meaning automatic. It was once thought that all of these processes were out of our control: heart rate, respiration, blood dilation, or blood vessel dilation, I should say. But what we found is that we actually have more control over this branch in the nervous system than we ever thought. There are two branches. One would be the parasympathetic nervous system. It's our rest and digest response. This is activated when we're in a state of relaxation. So hopefully while you're watching this video, you're in a nice, calm state of relaxation. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response. Another way of putting it, it's our stress activation. When we have short-term activation of this stress response, this is really good. If you're out in the middle of the woods and all of a sudden you hear crackling behind you and you look back and it is a coyote or hopefully not a mountain lion or a grizzly bear or black bear, the short-term activation of your stress response activates you to get out of there to fight or flee what's in front of you. If we didn't have that happen, we may not be able to mobilize a lot of energy and we may suffer the consequences of being attacked by that mountain lion or that bear. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, it can act in tandem. It's not just antagonistic or trying to push back on the sympathetic nervous system. We can activate that at the same time. This is what athletes experience when the stress response is heightened, but they also feel a heightened sense of relaxation. What we don't want to have is a suppression of that relaxation response and an overactivation of the stress response or the fight or flight response long term. This can lead to things like cardiovascular disease. This can lead to things like high blood glucose and diabetes. Of course, things like mental health related issues, anxiety, depression, and so forth. We never want long-term activation. So what is HRV and how does it fit in to this discussion of stress and physiological stress activation? I don't want this slide to scare you because it's a lot. This is a QRST EKG wave, which you don't need to know what it is. Basically, we're just looking at the polarization or electrical output of the heart, the polarization and depolarization of the heart. But basically, we are looking at some changes in the rhythm of your heart. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, why is this important? Like, is there really something that the rhythm of my heart can tell me about my stress response? And the answer is absolutely. Let me paint this picture for you. When we are in a state of relaxation, our heart rate tends to fluctuate like fairly high. There's a high level of fluctuation. What do I mean by that? Well, as you relax and you slowly inhale, your heart rate will significantly increase. And then as you exhale, your heart rate will significantly decrease. There's a lot of fluctuation going on between the inhale and the exhale when you're in a relaxed state. Whereas opposed to when you're in a stress state, your heart actually will stabilize. It will start to regulate itself. And you might think to yourself, well, I thought it seems like to me regulation of heart rate would be a good thing, but you're saying it's not. And what I'm saying is it's not. What we actually want to have is a heart rate that varies significantly. Why? Because that means adaptability. It means that your body and your stress response is adapting really, really well. Whereas when we're stressed and our heart is having a hard time adapting, or our nervous system's having a hard time adapting to the stress, then we see the heart rate actually begin to stabilize. There's a lack of overall change in its rhythm. I'm going to explain that in more detail here in a second, but I wanted that to kind of set the frame. So how can we use this metric that is heart rate variability as a direct metric of stress? The key takeaway here is that heart rate variability is going to serve as a guide as to how well or not so well your body is responding or adapting to physiological stress. As our heart rate variability remains stable over time, we're adapting well. That's a good thing. In the world of heart rate variability, normal is better, not higher or lower, normal. As our heart rate variability increases, let's say we're wearing a monitor where we see heart rate variability increasing. That means that our body's relaxation response is kicking into high gear. We're seeing a lot of change in the time between heartbeats, the variability of change in time between heartbeats, which is a sign of really good adaptability. It goes back to that really big peak and valley of heart rate that I was speaking to as you breathe when you're relaxed. If you start to see HRV decrease and decrease and decrease, well, your body now is showing signs of significant stress. It's not adapting very well. And that in and of itself should serve as a warning sign. So if you're wearing, let's say, a wearable that is giving you heart rate variability, and you see day in and day out, heart rate variability is decreasing, that is a sign that your nervous system is being overly activated. HRV should never be used out of context. Context is king for HRV. What do I mean by that? If I were to get up right now and sprint down the road and then sprint back to my office, we would see a significant reduction in heart rate variability. I'm stressed when I'm exercising. I'm moving really, really fast, and I'm mobilizing and using a lot of energy. So we expect heart rate to be really high, heart rate variability to be really low. And with that said, the thing to remember here is that that is expected. Well, is it expected to see that same characteristic of a significant increase in heart rate and a significant decrease in heart rate variability if I'm just sitting here doing emails? Well, no. And the reason being is because now we're seeing activation of my stress response in a time that it doesn't make a lot of sense for my body to mobilize a lot of energy. I'm just reading emails, but the email content is stressing me out. I'm experiencing psychological stress, but HRV was the thing that helped tune me into it. It was the metric that can help me become more aware as to how well I'm adapting or not adapting. Over time, we can learn what are those key triggers? What are those key events? What are those circumstances? What's the time of day? What are the fill in the blank? What are those things that are contributing to turning on or dialing up my stress response? And we understand that better through heart rate variability. And when we can find the different context or the clues, the triggers, the events, what that can help us with in the long run is identify how we can strategize our way of training a better response than being stuck in more of that stressed response in the moment. So we can learn how to adapt better through different training of the nervous system, which I'll talk about here in the practical application section. HRV is best understood in terms of direction and trends. Remember, the key takeaway here is stability is good, normal is good. You can find your normal range over time through more use of these technologies. Like with Hanu, we have this built into our software. We can find what is your normal range. And then when you're decreasing, we alert you and we say, we see some change. We see something that's going on here that is indicative of change in your stress response. When we see it going up, we can say, all right, we see that your relaxation response is really kicking into high gear. We know that the oscillations of a healthy heart are very complex. A healthy heart is going to rapidly adjust to any type of sudden physiological or psychological challenges. But when that doesn't happen, when we're really stressed and the heart and autonomic nervous system are having a lot of difficulty and they're struggling to adapt, well, that will manifest as well. The heart becomes more like a metronome and starts to pace itself. And the reason it does this is because it's all about self-preservation. Your autonomic nervous system is there. Your stress response is there to keep you alive. So it wants to use as much energy in the most appropriate places, your heart, your lungs, in order for you to survive and to keep going and not be eaten by the mountain lion, even though it's you doing emails and your brain doesn't know the difference. So we're back to this picture. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because I thought that it was a good idea to explain like what exactly is heart rate variability. So if the heart doesn't operate like a metronome, unless we're under times of certain stress, then what should it look like? Well, the heart speeds up and it slows down. If you take your heart rate and you see that your heart was beating at an average of 60 beats per minute, you would think, oh, that means that my heart is beating every single 1 second. And as if we averaged it out, that would be the case. That's actually not physiologically the case. We see it speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down. And the more it speeds up and slows down and adapts to sudden physiological or psychological changes, we see an increase in the time difference between heartbeats, or the variance. We see that increase. And again, that is a good sign. As HRV remains stable or goes up, excellent adaptability. As it goes down, we see difficulty and struggles with adapting to stress. Our whole goal is to maintain what is called psychological and physiological homeostasis. Homeostasis means stability. It means that everything is working in harmony with one another. And as we have better and better control over our nervous system, we have better and better ability to adapt physiologically and psychologically. HRV is also a longevity marker. It's a marker for disease. It's a marker for adaptability. As the cardiovascular system experiences damage throughout the years, whether that's from lifestyle decisions or whatever it may be, we know that HRV will become suppressed and is correlated with longevity and health outcomes. We also know that reduced HRV is associated with disease and loss of adaptability. And the last thing is that when the heart begins to regulate, it's because the nervous system is receiving the message of a need for self-preservation. I know I already mentioned that, but I believe it bears repeating. This is an interesting picture that I want to just spend no more than just a minute or so on. But there is a natural process. It's the speeding up and slowing of the heart rate across the respiratory cycle or breathing cycle, known as respiratory sinus arrhythmia. This happens to everybody, and this is not something that is negative, but you can see through here that we have a speeding and slowing down of the heart rate across the respiration cycle. Natural occurrence that we want to exercise, we need to train. And so how do we train that? Well, we train that by slowing our breathing. We train that by changing the mechanics of our breathing. We change that through things like biofeedback, which I'll talk about here in a second. But the main contributor to heart rate variability is this right here, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, the changes in heart rate as we inhale and exhale. There is something called HRV, or heart rate variability biofeedback. And essentially what biofeedback is it's using your biology as a guide, as feedback. This is my favorite go-to strategy that I use for enhancing our ability to control our stress response. We can use HRV as a guide to determine whether or not the practice that we're engaging in is affecting our nervous system in the direction we want it to, or more so, easily put, that we see an enhancement of our relaxation response. If we had to talk about an overarching purpose of HRV biofeedback, we are trying to improve our ability to self-regulate our emotional and mental health and enhance our quality of life and performance. So in the end, we have a lot of different strategies that come into HRV biofeedback, things like mindfulness, emotional self-regulation, and then something called resonance frequency breathing. We're not going to get into each of these for the sake of the day, but something like what my company produces, Hanu Health, this is what we build in as a predominant strategy, HRV biofeedback for self-regulation of our stress response. This is what HRV biofeedback might look like. You can see kind of over on this side right here where the cursor's at, that's heart rate, and we can see the changes in heart rate kind of across time. We see up here, this is a pacer up top here. We also see heart rate variability in real time. And the pacer that's blue and pink that you see on the screen, that kind of goes in and out, pacing you with your breathing. As you see the blue inhale, it blooms out like a flower, and then it will contract and go in towards the middle as you exhale. And you can use HRV as a guide. And again, you can see in this practice, as it's going in an upward direction, you can see it started around 20 and now is closer to around 35. That upward move of heart rate variability means that your relaxation response is kicking in. And at the end, if you're doing, like, let's say, a practice of HRV biofeedback with Hanu, you'll see kind of all the things that changed within your data. And we'll see kind of the really good movement in the direction of heart rate variability because you changed inherently the way that your nervous system responds. There are two primary ways that you can use HRV practically. One is as a recovery index, and the other one is as a stress index. HRV as a proxy for recovery is really referring to how is your nervous system recovering from workouts. So if you're pushing yourself really, really hard, which is indeed, again, stressing the body, are you giving yourself enough time to recover? Are you overreaching? Are you overtraining? If you're using it for that, then you would check it once in the morning after you wake up and say, is that remaining stable and the body's adapted to those workouts? Or is it moving in a downward direction, indicating that I might be overreaching or overtraining? And then we use it obviously for stress. And we're talking here more about psychological stress. So, how resilient is my nervous system to stress? Are the things that I'm experiencing in my life starting to compound to cause me a lot of trouble in that area? Am I experiencing difficulty with work or relationships or with finances or with whatever it may be? You fill in the blank. My commute. HRV can serve as a proxy for letting us know and sending us the alert signal that, hey, we might need to do something different in order to train resiliency of our stress response. Here's an example of how we can look at different trends. You can see that this person's average, if you look over here on this left-hand side in this picture, is 76. And you can see that with 76, I'm going to pull the laser pointer out here. You can see right here at 76, you could see that over the course of the last few days, it's remained stable. And then, hey, on Monday, we had a really good day. Like, it looks like the nervous system's really primed. 117 when your normal is 76. Things are looking pretty good. And then the next day, it kind of went back down to the normal range. If you were to see it, let's say, be at 76 typically, and then be down at 30 or 40 one day, well, now we have a sign. The nervous system is saying something is happening that is causing dysregulation or stress. You're overreaching, you're stressed, like something is going on, and that should be a sign. Well, what would you do that day? Well, that day we might do some HRV biofeedback or some breathing activities or some mindfulness meditation or some gratitude journaling. You can throw in so many different things that can help with regulating the nervous system and balancing that stress response. Here's another example of something that you might see for stress. So we can see that this person's typical baseline for HRV is 75 milliseconds. So one day, that's looking really good. 72, 0.87, that's right within your baseline range. We haven't gotten into power, but this is another number we look at and we say, okay, this is right within their normal range. But then they have a really, really difficult work week. And we see that while their average is typically 75, that morning they wake up and it's 49.89, or we'll say it's 50. So essentially, we're looking at, right around 25 or so points less or milliseconds less than their typical average. So a 38.81% drop. Well, what's that telling us? That's caution. The nervous system is seeing a significant reduction in heart rate variability, which means that the body is stressed and having a really hard time adapting. Here's another example. This is with Hanu. We see the person's HRV right around 100 milliseconds, their heart rate around 65, and that for them is a good score. They're really good in that range. 81, this is a good score for our platform. But later on in the day, we see that 100 drop down to 30, and we see their heart rate go up from 65 to 84. Well, you can see now their stress resiliency is really, really low. We have significant caution. Now it's time to do some HRV biofeedback. We need to do something to help move the nervous system in a different direction. We need to train resiliency in the moment, because if we stay like this for hours on end, we know that this has significant physiological and psychological detriments. We really want to intervene if we can't do it before we get here, when we notice that this is happening, we really want to intervene. That is heart rate variability in its nutshell. If I could give you one take-home point, it would be, I would say two take-home points. Number one is to really focus on the direction that heart rate variability is going. Always remember that a stable heart rate variability is good. An increase in heart rate variability is activation of your relaxation response, and a reduction in heart rate variability and a trend in a downward direction means that your stress response is being activated. If we see that your stress response is being activated, we want to take action. And the action can be in form of anything that helps cue your relaxation response. And you can use HRV as a measurement to know what is working for you in that domain and what is not as effective. So biofeedback, we may see HRV begin to really increase from your baseline or from where it was when you started. Use that data as a guide. Don't be afraid of it. It's complex, but it's also quite simple in terms of its practicality. Now, obviously, I've mentioned Hanu Health many times during this presentation. If you're interested in what we are offering, both our services in the mental health side, seeing one of our therapists, seeing one of our psychologists or our coaches, head on over to hanuhealth.com. You can also purchase just the platform and the wearable that we offer at hanuhealth.com. The code Alloy20 will give you 20% off. So we really want you to be a part of the Hanu family, especially if you're suffering and dealing with some significant stress, anxiety, or any other emotional mental health issues. Follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, wherever you do your social media. It's at Hanu Health. It has been an absolute privilege to be able to share this with you all. I really look forward to the future and how we can use this information and data to really drive better direction for mental health and for stress reduction. Thank you so much, everybody. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and take care.